Hello. It's going to be an odd thing to say this, but I hope you never have to follow the guidance in this video, because this video is for the worst case scenario. Now imagine it. You're in the exam hall and some bloke's giving it, you've 90 minutes, crack on. So you open up that question booklet and pow! What leaps out at you are two of the most hideous questions on Inspector Calls that you can conceive of. Now luckily, it's a very rare year where both questions are out and out howlers. Yes, some years one question will be a real eye stinger, but usually to compensate, the second question will be more accessible. And remember, you only have to answer one question. So think of this video then as emergency procedures. If both questions are horrible, then you'll be able to deal with it. Now I'm not going to bore you with the story of my life, but I remember all too sharply back when I was at school, you know, before electricity and Christianity, and I was opening the question booklet in the exam, and I remember experiencing that sickening, sinking feeling when I looked at those disgustingly difficult questions. And you know that feeling I'm talking about, you know, where your heart lurches and your guts feel like they're going into free fall. Luckily, over the next few slides, you'll see how I take that moment of raw panic and turn things around so that you're still very much an A-grade prospect. Now here's a beast of a question from a few years back. How does Priestley show, in his presentation of Mrs. Burling, that she often pretends to be something she's not? Now this question's got a horrifically narrow focus. Why it couldn't just be a question on how does Priestley present Mrs. Burling, I don't know. Perhaps the examiner's angry with the world, or he's lost his season ticket or something, I don't know. I just know that we've now got to deal with this beast of a question. So, once you've identified the focus of the question, and the focus of this question is how or in what ways does Mrs. Burling pretend to be something she's not. Once I've thought about that, my first step is to brain dump. Now bear in mind, this is a question that I'm not confident with. If I was confident with this question, what I would get down on my plan at this stage would be a lot more selective. But because I'm not confident with this question, I'm just getting down more general stuff about the character Mrs. Burling. These are emergency procedures, remember. So the normal way of doing things is out. And a good meaty brain dump starts us off nicely. So here's 4 things I do know about the character of Mrs. Burling. These things I can dump on the page pretty quickly. I know she's a snob. I know she denies either charity, she's obsessed with manners or social etiquette, to use the more A-star phrasing, and she readily accepts male domination, male authority, patriarchal society, call it what you will. So let's take the first idea from my brain dump. The question, of course, was how does Priestley show in his presentation of Mrs. Burling that she often pretends to be something she is not? And my first idea, which initially has nothing to do with this question, is that Mrs. Burling is a snob. So Mrs. Burling's a snob. Well, I now need to take that basic skeletal idea, I need to add some layers onto it. I need to develop it into a response that actually answers the exam question. So I've gone and got myself some evidence that she's a snob. One of her favourite lines is, "Girls of that class." But wait a minute, I think I've just gone and got myself a link to the exam question. Because she's a snob who talks disparagingly of girls of that class, but she pretends to help the poor. Pretends, of course, was a key word from the question. And she talks to Inspector Gould about her work in helping deserving cases. And I need to make sure, when I'm planning my response, that I'm not neglecting, I'm not forgetting about the need to analyse language. That is the difference between an A to C exam response and a D to G exam response. The one that takes the words that the writer uses and analyses the effects, that's always going to score higher. So I'm going to lock in on that word deserving from her work in helping deserving cases. Because deserving, bit like ugly, bit like beautiful, deserving is a subjective concept. It varies from person to person. And it's Mrs. Burling who determines who is a deserving case. And the problem, of course, is that Mrs. Burling sees the poor as immoral. It brings us back to that quotation from the start. Girls of that class emphasises the offensive prejudices that she harbours towards the proletariat, the poor. It's not too charitable an attitude at all. Now in the next slide, we're going to take these ideas, these steps that I've developed, and turn it, spin it into that polished paragraph, brimful of sweet, sweet A-star goodness. And here we are. I'll read the paragraph out and then I'll just explain why it's such an effective piece of writing. Mrs. Burling feigns a concern for helping the proletariat. She tells Gould of her charity work in helping deserving cases. The word deserving is very subjective though, and Mrs. Burling's view of deserving cases is affected by her prejudices towards the working class. Her four-word unfinished sentence, girls of that class, telegraphs her snobbery and her assumptions about the proletariat's lack of morals. Moreover, the term girls to describe young women conveys a patronising tone. In addition, the plosive g in girls creates a harsh tone, capturing her disgust and contempt towards these people. Mrs. Burling then pretends to be charitable, but actually withholds assistance owing to her toxic prejudices. So just take 10 seconds to let that sink into your pores, and then we'll deconstruct it. The first thing you'll notice is that I've got the word feigns in bold. Feigns is a synonym or a word meaning the same thing as pretend, which was the key word from the question. Mrs. Burling pretends, Mrs. Burling fakes, Mrs. Burling feigns. It's a nice high-level word. Proletariat, I've got that in bold because that's a high-level way of talking about the poor or the working class. Work in helping deserving cases. The reason I've highlighted that is because I've embedded my evidence here. I've not just said Mrs. Burling feigns a concern for helping the proletariat work in deserving cases. I've tried to weave the quotation in helping deserving cases into a sentence, so it just flows a little bit better. It's called embedding your quotation. You're embedding the quote into your own sentence. The word deserving, so I'm locking in on a word there and I'm explaining the effect of that. Her four-word unfinished sentence, girls of that class, telegraphs her snobbery and her assumptions about the proletariat's lack of morals. That bit in bold there, telegraphs to morals, that's my effect. That's me analysing what the writer's trying to say or do or show with language, girls of that class. Moreover, that's a little signpost to the examiner that I'm going deeper. I'm going to pull out another detail about the language. Girls conveys a patronising tone. She doesn't call them women, of course, she calls them girls, so I've locked in on that. And then I've gone even deeper here, and this sounds a bit scary, but let me explain it. It's very simple, really. In addition, the plosive g in girls creates a harsh tone. A plosive sound is just what I call a spitting sound, like a b or t or f. It's a letter that you have to almost spit. And plosive is very good for kind of conveying bitter tone or aggressive tone or a harsh tone. So I've said that a plosive g captures her disgust and contempt towards these people, girls of that class. Again, because I've locked in on that language a third time, I've already said it shows her snobbery, I've talked about the patronising tone, now I'm talking about the plosive conveying her disgust. You can see how that is pushing me towards the heights of A-star glory. My last line is very important as well. Mrs. Burling then pretends to be charitable, but actually withholds assistance owing to a toxic prejudice. That last line with pretends is linking back, looping back to the essay question. Nobody can accuse me of waffling off topic. I'm sticking to the question the examiner's set. I'm going to whisk through these next few slides very quickly. You can pause them at your leisure, because it will just show me doing the same thing but with a different point, taking it from skeletal idea and adding some layers on so it responds to the essay question. Now, my second idea that I brain dumped a while back was Mrs. Burling denies Eva charity. But of course I have to tread carefully here because I've already talked about that girls of that class quote. I don't want to be repeating points in an exam. So let's see where I go with this idea. Mrs. Burling denies Eva charity. And I say here that it is pride that compels Mrs. Burling to deny Eva help. If you recall, Eva calls herself Mrs. Burling when she goes to see Mrs. Burling for help. This is foreshadowing, of course, because Eva is carrying Eric Burling's child. But Mrs. Burling, disgusted that a lowly working class girl would appropriate the proud name of Burling, decides to use her power and influence to stop Eva getting the charity that she craves. Now, one of the things you're judged against in this exam is how well you can engage with the themes, the messages of J.B. Priestley. And Priestley uses Mrs. Burling's pride to represent the true immoral nature of capitalist society. The Burlings in this play represent or embody the ruling tier of capitalist society, the bourgeoisie. And Priestley is suggesting, through their mistreatment and the way that they all sin against Eva, that capitalism as a system is almost like going against God. It's immoral, it's sinful, it's wrong. Well, this is all very fascinating, Mr. Taylor, but how is it going to link to the essay question you've been set? Namely, how does Mrs. Burling pretend to be something she's not? And there it is. What we can say is that Mrs. Burling pretends to be concerned with right or wrong, because she's got that obsession with manners. But actually, the real sense of right or wrong, the idea of being a moral person and treating people a right way or wrong way, that seems to have less impact on Mrs. Burling than her blind commitment to observing manners or social etiquette. Here's some evidence that she's obsessed with manners. She has a go at Mr. Burling for praising the cook in front of Gerald. Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. I'm not forgetting my commitment to analysing language. Sibilance is just a posh word for the alliteration of the s sound, supposed to say such things. And I'm saying here that, a bit like plosives, it kind of captures her bitter tone, perhaps her spiteful nature, and it highlights her obsession in following codes of etiquette or good manners. And presto changeo, I've turned those ideas, those steps, into another high quality paragraph. And you can have a look at this at your leisure and think about why it's good. I think I've missed out my linguistic analysis of the sibilance, the alliteration of the S, only because of a lack of space. But I could fit that somewhere into this paragraph without too much difficulty. And there we are then. There's our emergency procedures if we're faced with two cripplingly hideous exam questions on the day. It's unlikely to happen, but we know what to do now. We start with a brain dump, we get everything we know about the character, or a lot of things we know about the character, on the page. Then we try and link some of that stuff to the exam question. When you plan your response, remember you are looking at the effects of language and some of Priestley's themes and messages that he's trying to get out to the audience. And when you're writing it up, use the appropriate kind of formal essay writing style. If you can use high-level terms like proletariat, shallow values and etiquette, by all means do. Just make sure, of course, that you're using them accurately. If you're a little bit unconfident using them, perhaps revert to a simpler phrasing style. So yeah, emergency. What emergency? We now know exactly what to do if the questions are horrible.